I think it's important to, for LGBTQ people to feel part of that national fabric. And the reality is you can't get people to feel part of that fabric if you're going to allow the law to continue sex stereotyping to manifest and perpetrate.
Hi, so it's great to see you all.
Hi there.
Hey.
Hey, Liz.
Sachin, can you talk about sort of the longer arc of Title VII discrimination cases involving sex?
In 1965, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, that's the agency that enforces the statute, they issued a series of guidelines on sex discrimination about what it actually means to say that you can't discriminate against any individual because of such individual's sex. And the EEOC guidelines made it pretty clear that also includes not relying on stereotypes about what men and women can do or what men and women should do. So the idea that women are too weak to be law enforcement or don't have sufficient stamina.
Mm-hmm.
In the 60s and 1970s, there were plenty of stereotypes about this, including certain kinds of jobs were men's work and certain kinds of jobs were women's work. The idea wasn't that they couldn't do it, it's that it was more appropriate for a woman to be a secretary and not a bank manager.
Okay, so Marcia, can you talk about how this theory then applies in the context of sexual orientation?
There are a lot of stereotypes about how people ought to order their romantic lives. And one of the most fundamental stereotypes about our romantic lives is that if we identify as female, we ought to be romantically attracted to people who identify as male. So anybody who identifies as gay, lesbian, or bisexual pretty much automatically defies that stereotype. There are other kinds of stereotypes that sort of go with it too, and those also are about sort of some gender expression, ways of behaving, ways of interacting with other people, ways of dressing, all that kinds of stuff. And those too get implicated sometimes in some of the cases that we see brought by gay, lesbian, or bisexual plaintiffs.
Or what the employees are fundamentally saying is nothing new, right? That this is just this is kind of a logical extension of those older cases that talk about women with children, young children. Price Waterhouse, that talks about, right, a woman who's denied an opportunity because she's perceived as too masculine, right, that this is really not fundamentally different. That it's the same kind of anti-stereotyping principle that applies.
The Price Waterhouse case might be one of my favorite cases ever, mostly because it stands for the principle that, like, you can be a woman that, like, swears a lot in the workplace. And if the men swear a lot too and they get promoted, like, you shouldn't be denied a promotion if you have, like, very coarse vocabulary. Can you say more, like, about, why do you think, like, sex stereotyping is a problem in today's workplace?
When you rely on a stereotype, you basically take a generalization about a group and assume that the same thing is true for an individual. And so in the example of, well, we shouldn't hire women to be prison guards because they can't handle the circumstances of a prison, that's a pretty simple problem, which is, instead of relying on stereotypes, why don't you just validly test to see whether they can do what the job really requires?
Right.
Stereotypes also guide what kinds of behavior is seen as acceptable in the workforce. And so they sort of force people to fit into boxes that that might be really challenging. And so they create a burden at work for some kinds of people to act in particular ways that may not be within their nature. They also reinforce ideas that there's only one kind of way to do some jobs. And so, or one kind of way to, like, talk at your job, one kind of way to behave at your job, that also sort of reinforces then exclusion of certain people from the workforce. And it helps to reinforce labor market segregation, even from the start. So it's pretty well documented that young women, from the time that their children start thinking about their future life in ways that encompass sex stereotypes like caregiving, and that young men don't. And so all of the life plans that a young person makes sort of builds up to reinforce the segregation that means that we lose out on the talents of a good portion of the population.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember when I had a relative in the hospital, there were some men who were in the nursing roles, and they did such a wonderful job, and they brought so much additional value to the job in different ways that I think maybe someone who assumed that this only a female job wouldn't even have thought of the additional value they might bring in that role.
Title VII is a super statute, right? It is the kind of statute that really reflects our national values and what we should live up to in our national norms, and it's supposed to import many of our constitutional values to the private right to private actors in private spaces. And I think it's important to for LGBTQ people to feel part of that national fabric. And the reality is you can't get people to feel part of that fabric if you're going to allow the law to continue sex stereotyping to manifest and perpetrate or continues to continue in the workplace, because that's where many of us kind of have second homes, right? That's where we feel a sense of pride, and a sense where I always say that people's families and their jobs are two of the most important things to them. And we didn't solve completely the issue with same-sex marriage being constitutionally protected in Obergefell, but that was one important step, and I think this is the next important coordinate step. And so it is very important for LGBTQ people to feel equally a part of the the national endeavor to have these cases be decided in their favor.